Loner rancher saved a girl kneeling down begging him. She said, "I'll be your wife." The wind came like a whip across the ridge, sharp with snow and bitter enough to strip the breath from a body. I staggered out from the trees, pine branches heavy with white, my dress torn ragged, my feet bare and bleeding against the frozen ground. My lungs burned, my hands shook. Days had passed since the bandits fell upon our wagon train south of Riverton. I had run and kept running until the world itself blurred into frost and silence. When I finally saw the thin line of smoke rising from a squat cabin tucked against the slope, I thought perhaps it was heaven's trick. My legs buckled. Still, I stumbled forward, down the hill, toward the horse tied out front, toward the wooden porch where a man sat in stillness. My throat was cracked and raw, but the words scraped out anyway, half a cry, half a plea. "I'll be your wife," I whispered, though I hardly knew what I said. "Only, don't let me die here." The man didn't move at first. His elbows rested on his knees, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. For a long moment, he seemed carved out of the land itself, silent and unyielding. Then he rose, slow and steady, and came down the steps. His boots crunched against the snow. "I was once just as lost," he said, voice low, calm as the winter air. "Come inside." I collapsed before I could answer. I woke to warmth, not the harsh fever of exhaustion, but the clean heat of a fire close by. The smell of wood smoke filled my lungs. A coarse blanket lay over me, rough against my cheek but blessedly warm. My body ached, bruised ribs, raw arms, blistered feet, but I was alive, sheltered inside 4 timber walls. He was there, kneeling near the hearth, stirring a pot. His frame was broad, worn by labor, his shirt patched in places, his hands thick with callus. He turned his head just enough to look at me. "You awake?" I managed a nod, my throat too tight to speak. He poured water into a tin cup and carried it to me. My hands trembled too hard to hold it steady, so he guided it, patient, until the warmth slid down my throat. "Name's Ethan McGraw," he said. "Anna," I whispered, "Anna Whitaker." He gave a small nod, neither pitying nor pressing. The hours that followed came in fragments. My memory blurred between firelight and the storm still clawing outside the walls. He didn't ask me for explanations I wasn't ready to give. He only let me rest, let me eat, let me breathe. When at last the strength returned enough for words, the grief broke loose like floodwater. "We were heading west," I told him, voice cracking. "Riverton. Then the bandits came. They killed." My chest locked. I pressed a hand against my mouth, fighting the sob. No one else got away, just me. Ethan studied the flames, not my face. His jaw tightened, but his voice was even. "I know the kind of men who do that. I'm sorry." There was no pity in his tone, only understanding, as if he carried his own shadows in silence. The next morning, I sat wrapped in his old wool coat on the porch. My feet were bound in cloth, the wounds cleaned. My hair hung damp down my back from where he'd given me water to wash. He stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to me. I could hardly lift my eyes to his, the question heavy on my tongue. "Why did you take me in?" He sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the prairie beyond, pale and endless under frost. "Because someone once did the same for me." I followed his eyes to the horizon. The land stretched wide, quiet, merciless, yet strangely waiting. The warmth of the mug seeped into my hands, and I remembered the words my mother used to whisper when fear took hold of me as a child. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Psalm 46:1. The verse lingered in me now, not as memory, but as breath itself. Perhaps he had not abandoned me. Perhaps his help had come in the shape of a quiet rancher who asked for nothing in return. And so the story began. Not with promises of love, not with riches or rescue sung in ballads, but with survival. With a woman on the edge of death and a man who had learned to live alone with his grief. With a cabin half buried in snow and the thin flame of mercy burning inside. What I did not know then, shivering in that coat too large for my shoulders, was that this place, this man, would become more than refuge. It would become home. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. When I surfaced from the dark, the first thing I knew was the crackle of fire. It snapped and sighed within a stone hearth, the scent of pine resin and smoke drifting through the small room. The blanket over me was coarse, smelling faintly of wool and earth, but it trapped the heat against my skin. For a long moment I didn't move, too weak even to lift my hand. My body ached from crown to heel. Scrapes across my arms, bruises along my ribs, feet raw and torn where the cold had bitten through. Then a shadow crossed before the fire. The man. He crouched by the pot suspended on an iron hook, stirring with deliberate slowness. His frame filled the narrow space, broad across the shoulders, lean with work. His jaw was rough with days of stubble, his shirt patched at the elbows, his hands thick with callus and old scars. "You awake?" he said, not as a question, but as a simple truth. I tried to answer, but my throat was sand and ash. My lips cracked as I formed the word. He poured water into a dented tin cup, carried it to me, and set it carefully against my mouth. My hands shook too hard to hold it steady, so he guided it, tilting just enough for the warm sip to slide down my throat. It stung, but it was life. "Slow," he murmured, "don't rush." I drank until the cup was empty, then slumped back against the rough pillow. My chest heaved. He took the cup, set it aside, and sat on the stool near the cot. For a while he didn't speak, and I was grateful. The silence was gentler than any question. At last I managed to whisper, Anna Whitaker." He nodded once. "Ethan McGraw." The name carried a weight, as if the land itself had carved it. Hours bled into one another. Fever gripped me by turns, shaking my bones, soaking the blanket with sweat. At times I drifted, sure the dark would claim me. At others, I woke to find him pressing a damp cloth to my forehead, or lifting my head enough to sip broth from a wooden spoon. The stew was simple, rabbit, onion, the faint bite of salt, but it steadied me more than any medicine. Once, in the haze between waking and sleep, I muttered, "Ohio. I came from Ohio." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "That's far." "I was a seamstress," I added, though my voice faltered. It was all I could offer, a fragment of who I had been before the snow and blood. "Rest now," he said, and the words closed the matter. The cabin itself was little more than one room. A bed against the far wall, a narrow table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars sealed in wax. Tools hung neatly by the door, saws, hammers, an old rifle leaning in the corner. Every board bore the mark of his hand, patched, mended, made to last. It was not comfort as I had once known, but it was shelter, and for the first time in many nights I was not at the mercy of the storm. Still, the storm lingered in me. In the fever I saw faces, my brothers, the others from the wagon train, lost in smoke and gunfire. Each time I woke gasping, Ethan was there, steady, silent, as if rooted like the timbers around us. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. My body was weak, but no longer trembling. I sat upright with effort, the blanket falling to my lap. Light filtered through the single window, pale and cold, but it carried promise. Ethan came in from the yard with a pail of water, snow still clinging to his boots. He set it down, glanced at me, and gave the smallest nod, as though to say, "You're still here." I drew the blanket tighter and whispered thanks, not only to him, but upward to the one my mother had once taught me to trust. Perhaps he had sent me here. Perhaps mercy had not run out after all. The first real words between us came as the fever loosened its grip. I was strong enough to sit by the fire while he worked at the table, trimming a strip of leather for a harness. My voice was rough, but I forced it past my lips. "You live alone?" He looked up only briefly, the knife still steady in his hand. "I do now." I traced the rim of the tin cup in my lap, unsure if I had the right to ask more. "For long?" "Long enough," he said, and after a pause added, "My wife, Clara, is buried on the hill behind the barn. A wooden cross marks her." The words landed heavy, not with bitterness, but with the kind of weight that never leaves a man's shoulders. I bowed my head, feeling the ache of his grief echo against my own. "I'm sorry." He set the knife down, folded the leather carefully, and sat across from me. His eyes were the color of creekstone, steady and unreadable. "What about you?" I swallowed. "My brother had a farm in Ohio. He raised me after our parents died. He was killed in the war." The old pain rose sharp in my chest. After that, I had nothing. So I joined a wagon train west, hoping to start again. Ethan didn't speak right away. He rubbed his jaw, eyes fixed on the fire as if searching for something inside it. "The West doesn't forgive easy," he said finally. I thought of the bandits, the screams, the snow swallowing my tracks. My hands tightened on the cup. "No," I whispered, "it doesn't." The silence that followed was not empty. It held the weight of two lives cut open by loss, stitched together by chance beneath the same roof. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, but inside, the fire threw its warmth across the floorboards as if defying the cold. Ethan rose, adjusted the pot over the flames, and poured a ladle of stew into a bowl. He handed it to me, not looking for thanks, not asking more questions. I took it, my hands steady now, and for the first time in many days, I ate without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Days settled into a rhythm, though each one felt borrowed, as if the storm outside could still reclaim me at any hour. Ethan went about his work with the same quiet steadiness he had shown since the first night. He tended the horse, chopped wood, checked the traps along the creek. I watched from the porch wrapped in his old coat, my feet still bound, trying to believe this life was real. It wasn't entirely cut off. Once, a rider passed along the trail at a distance, coat flapping in the wind. Ethan told me it was a preacher who made his rounds through the scattered homesteads, carrying little more than a Bible and saddlebag. "He stops by every few months," Ethan said, "reads a passage, blesses the ground, moves on." There was reverence in his tone, though faint, the way a man might speak of rain after a drought. Another afternoon, he spoke of Widow Thompson, who lived 4 homesteads west. "She lost her husband to fever, runs the place with her boy. Tough woman, brings news when she can." His eyes flicked toward me as he said it, a question unspoken. Would I be that strong if left alone? I wasn't sure of the answer. From him, I learned there was a town called Riverton, a half-day's ride north. Market days drew ranchers and trappers, women with baskets of bread, men bartering hides and tools. He hadn't gone in months, not since autumn. Too much noise, too many eyes. And always, beneath his words, ran the shadow of danger. The bandits who had torn apart our wagon train were not ghosts. They roamed these ridges still, bold enough to strike travelers, but clever enough to vanish before lawmen rode out. Sometimes I caught Ethan pausing on the porch, scanning the tree line, his rifle leaning against the doorframe. "They might come back," I said once, my voice barely above the crack of the fire. "They might," he answered, and nothing more. It was not reassurance, but it was truth. Somehow that steadied me more than promises would have. The world beyond the cabin was not safe, not kind. But here, within these 4 rough-hewn walls, with the fire and the man who kept it, I began to believe survival was more than a chance, it was a choice. By the week's end, my strength began to return. I could walk from the cot to the porch without leaning too heavily on the doorframe, could fetch water from the pail by myself without spilling half of it. The air outside was sharp and clean, laced with the scent of pine, and each breath filled me with something I hadn't felt in months, purpose, however small. Ethan never urged me to work, but he didn't stop me when I tried. The first task I claimed was mending. A torn shirt lay folded on the back of a chair, its sleeve ragged at the seam. I set a candle near the table, threaded a needle, and let my hands remember what they once knew. The fabric was coarse, worn from years of use, but the needle slipped through steady. By the time Ethan returned from chopping wood, the sleeve was whole again. He paused in the doorway, arms loaded with logs. His eyes caught on the shirt, then on me. Didn't think anyone could fix that. I laid it across the chair with quiet pride. It just needed time. The next morning, he set a pair of trousers near the hearth without a word. That evening, a saddle strap. Before long, I had gathered a small pile beside my cot, each piece a part of his life worn thin by years of solitude. Sewing was my way of repaying shelter, though deep down I knew he hadn't asked for repayment. Other tasks followed. I carried kindling in from the yard, balancing the pieces in my arms, though my steps faltered on the frozen ground. I scrubbed the tin plates by the creek, my breath rising in clouds as the icy water numbed my fingers. Once, I tried to lift the chicken coop door to tighten the hinge, only to slip on the packed snow and fall hard on my side. Ethan was there in 2 strides, his hand pulling me upright before I could catch my breath. "You don't need to do everything at once," he said, brushing straw from my sleeve. "I don't want to be useless." His eyes lingered on me, unreadable. At last he said, "You're not." There was no softness in his tone, no coddling, just certainty. It steadied me more than comfort could. The days stretched and folded into each other, each with its rhythm. In the morning, Ethan led the horse from the barn while I swept the floorboards clean. At midday, we ate bread crusts dipped in stew, steam curling into the air. In the evenings, we worked side by side, he shaping wood with a draw knife, I darning socks by lamplight. Words were scarce, but silence had a way of filling itself, layered with small sounds, the creak of the chair, the hiss of the fire, the steady scratch of my needle. One night, he handed me a shirt so frayed it was nearly threadbare. "That one's been waiting a year." I smiled faintly, setting the lantern closer. "Then it's about time." He sat across from me, a newspaper in his hands, though I noticed his eyes lifting from the page more often than they stayed on it. The warmth of the lamp drew us into a circle apart from the storm outside, a circle I found myself reluctant to leave. When my stitches were done, I set the shirt neatly folded on the table. Ethan took it without a word, only the briefest dip of his head, but his silence carried weight. It said more than gratitude spoken aloud. As the weeks turned, I ventured farther from the cabin. Together we repaired the south fence line where snow had bent the rails. He dug the post holes while I steadied the beams, my fingers raw from the cold, my shoulders aching from the effort. Still, there was a satisfaction in laboring beside him. We worked in rhythm, unspoken, our breaths rising in pale clouds. "You always this stubborn?" he asked, driving the spade into the frozen earth. "You always this surprised when someone keeps pace?" I answered, and to my surprise he gave a short, unguarded chuckle. The sound stayed with me long after the work was done. At night, I lay on the cot in the corner, listening to the quiet movements of the cabin. The sound of his boots settling by the door, the scrape of wood as he added another log to the fire. The world outside remained cold, vast, and filled with dangers unseen. But inside these walls something new was taking root. Each day carried its own weight, each task its own meaning. I was no longer only a survivor. I was becoming part of a life being rebuilt, stitch by stitch, fence post by fence post. And in the stillness, with the firelight dancing across the floor and the snow pressing against the window, I began to believe that I belonged. One evening, the storm pressed hard against the cabin walls, the wind moaning through the chinks between the logs. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the floor. I had finished mending a torn sock and set it aside, my eyes heavy from the close work. Ethan reached to the shelf above the hearth and pulled down a worn leather-bound book. He opened it with care, the pages yellowed and frayed at the edges. For a while he read silently, lips moving without sound. Then his voice carried softly into the room. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Matthew 5:4. The words struck through me like a bell tolling in the dark. I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting back the sudden sting of tears. My mother's voice came back to me in that moment, gentle and steady, reciting the same verse by lamplight in our Ohio kitchen. She had spoken it when the war took my brother, when the nights seemed endless and cruel. Now, here, in a cabin on the far edge of Wyoming, the verse returned, not as memory alone, but as promise. The fire snapped. My chest shook, and I turned my face from Ethan, ashamed of the tear slipping down. He didn't move closer, didn't ask why. He only closed the book and set it back on the shelf. The silence that followed was filled not with emptiness, but with something steady, something that reached beyond either of us. I wiped my cheeks with the edge of the blanket and whispered, almost to myself, "Maybe he hasn't forgotten." Ethan's eyes lifted from the fire to me. He said nothing, but the look in them told me he understood. He, too, had known loss. He, too, carried questions unanswered. Yet here we were, alive, breathing, kept for reasons neither of us could yet name. The wind howled louder, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin there was warmth enough. Faith, fragile as an ember, glowed again in the quiet between us. The days grew longer, though winter still held the land in its grip. I found myself moving more easily through the cabin, fetching wood without stumbling, carrying pails of water to the hearth. Each task wove me deeper into the rhythm of the place, until I could scarcely remember the helpless woman who had first staggered to his door. One night, as the wind quieted and the fire burned steady, Ethan handed me a coat I hadn't seen before. It was mine, the faded wool I had worn when I collapsed on his porch, torn across the shoulder. The seam was neatly mended, the stitches uneven but careful. I looked up at him. "You did this." He shrugged, almost sheepish. "Didn't sit right, you wearing it half ruined." I traced the stitches with my fingers, each one a mark of his patience. "Good hands," I murmured. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a hint of warmth behind the stone gray of his eyes. From then on, the space between us seemed to shift in small, unspoken ways. When we worked at the table, our chairs drifted closer. When we carried whales for the fence, his hand brushed mine as he passed the beam. Neither of us pulled away. In the barn, while he brushed down the mare, I found myself leaning on the stall rail beside him, content simply to stand in silence as the horse snorted softly into the straw. One evening, I sat by the window stitching a new curtain for the cabin's lone glass pane. Snow drifted outside, pale against the dark. Ethan sat near the fire sharpening his knife, but I felt his gaze slide toward me more than once. When I finally hung the curtain, he rose, tested the fabric with his hand, and nodded. "Looks like it's always been there." It was a simple thing, yet the words filled me with a warmth deeper than the fire could give. Later that night, when I lay on the cot, I listened for the sound of his boots moving about the cabin, the scrape of metal, the low thud of wood against the hearth, the faint sigh he gave before settling into his chair. I closed my eyes, heart steady for the first time in many weeks. The world beyond the cabin walls was still uncertain, still dangerous. But inside, with each shared silence, each repaired seam, each unspoken kindness, something was taking root. I didn't dare name it yet, neither did he. But when our eyes met across the fire, when our hands brushed in the passing of a tool or the lift of a rail, the truth was there, quiet and sure, waiting. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The storm had not yet come, but the air carried its weight. Clouds pressed low against the ridge, dark and swollen, while the wind sighed through the pines in uneasy whispers. Inside the cabin, I sat with a scrap of fabric in my lap, needle idle in my hand, though I could not bring myself to push the thread through. My mind would not settle. Ethan was across the room, mending a harness strap, his hands steady and sure. He always seemed steady, as if the earth itself leaned on him. And what was I but a woman broken down by the road, patched together only by his mercy? The thought had been gnawing at me for days, and at last it rose to my lips.
"I have nothing to offer you." The words came out low, brittle, my gaze fixed on the uneven stitch I had made, though I could hardly see it through the blur in my eyes. "Not really. Not food, not money. I'm no farmer, no rancher's wife. I'm only alive because you pulled me in from the snow. I can't—" My throat closed before I could finish. For a moment there was only the sound of firewood settling in the hearth, a crackle and sigh that filled the silence between us. Then Ethan set the strap aside and crossed the room. His boots struck the floor slow, deliberate, until he stopped just before me. I dared not lift my head. Shame burned hot in my chest, heavier than the bruises I still carried. I expected him to confirm what I already feared, that I was a burden, a passing charity. Instead, his voice came quiet but firm, as though he had rehearsed it long before I spoke. "You are alive," he said. "That's enough." I looked up then, startled, searching his face for any trace of pity. There was none. Only the raw honesty of a man who had known loss, who had lived long enough to measure what truly mattered. He knelt beside my chair, so we were near eye level.
"Anna, you don't have to earn your place here. You're breathing. That's reason enough." The needle slipped from my fingers and clattered softly against the wood. I pressed my hand to my mouth, stifling a sob I hadn't meant to let free. The truth of his words struck deeper than any comfort I had ever known. For months I had been running, believing I had to prove my worth to survive. Yet here, in this small cabin on the ridge, someone told me I was already enough. Ethan did not reach for me, not yet. But the weight of his words settled into me like warmth after cold, like bread after hunger. And for the first time since Ohio, since the wagon, since everything fell apart, I believed it might be true. The blizzard came at dusk, rolling down from the mountains like a great white wall. The wind roared through the trees, tearing at the shingles and rattling the shutters until it seemed the whole cabin might lift and fly into the storm. Snow beat against the glass in heavy sheets, sealing us inside a world of howling gray. Ethan had stacked wood high by the hearth, feeding the flames until the cabin glowed warm, though every gust threatened to steal that warmth away. I sat on the cot in the corner, wrapped in his old wool coat, watching the fire twist and leap. My heart matched its rhythm, restless, unsteady. For weeks I had told myself I was only a guest here, that once the thaw came I would leave. Yet with every day, with every small kindness, that lie grew thinner. Tonight, under the scream of the wind, it tore open. I could not go on pretending. The storm gave me courage, or perhaps it stripped me bare. My voice cracked against the storm's roar, but Ethan heard me. "I don't want to sleep in the corner anymore." He looked up from where he crouched, steadying the iron pot above the coals. His brow furrowed, as if weighing whether he had heard me rightly. I swallowed hard, my hands twisting in the folds of the coat. "I don't mean tonight only," I said. "I mean, I don't want to live as though I don't belong here. I want to be by your side, not because I must, but because I choose to." The room seemed to shrink, the firelight pulling us close while the storm raged outside. Ethan set the ladle aside and rose, his shadow stretching tall across the wall. He crossed the room in 3 steps, then stopped just before me. "Anna," he said, my name low and steady on his lips, "you don't have to prove yourself to me." I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze. I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking if you'll let me stay, not as someone you rescued, not as a burden, but as someone who chooses this place, and you. The storm bellowed, shaking the timbers, but in that moment I heard only the silence between us. His eyes searched mine, not with doubt, but with a depth I had not yet seen in him. For a heartbeat, I feared he might turn away, that he would remind me of his losses, of the wife he had buried on the hill. But instead, Ethan reached out his hand. Slowly, deliberately, as though giving me the choice to take it or leave it. I placed my trembling hand in his, and he closed his fingers around mine with a gentleness that undid me. It was not the grasp of pity, but of equal ground, of shared weight. My breath caught, my heart steadied. Without a word, he drew me up from the cot. I stood before him, my knees weak yet certain. The firelight flickered across his face, carving it in warm shadow. He lifted his free hand to brush a loose strand of hair from my cheek, and though his touch was rough with calluses, it was the softest thing I had ever known. I felt my voice falter, but I managed, "Ethan, I don't want to wake tomorrow wondering if you'll send me away." His forehead touched mine, his breath mingling with mine, warm despite the cold pressing at the walls. "I won't," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The storm howled and clawed, yet inside the cabin the world was still, as if the wind itself bowed to what passed between us. I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest. His arm came around me without hesitation, firm and sure, as though it had always belonged there. The fire popped, sparks leaping, but neither of us looked away. In his heartbeat, steady beneath my ear, I found something stronger than safety. I found belonging. That night, we did not speak further. Words would have only diminished what had already been decided. We sat by the fire, side by side, hand in hand, while the blizzard raged outside. And in the hush of that storm-tossed night, I knew that I was no longer a guest in this place, nor in his life. I had chosen, and so had he. The storm broke with morning light. A pale sky stretched over the ridge, the snow gleaming where it had drifted deep against the fence line. I woke not in the corner cot, but in the chair beside the fire, my hand still resting in Ethan's, his coat draped over us both. The fire had burned low, yet I felt no chill. For the first time in years, I rose knowing I was not alone. That day, we stepped into the cold together. The air was sharp, the snow crunching under our boots as Ethan led me to the slope behind the barn. He pointed to the north wall of the cabin, where the timbers sagged with age. "Been meaning to add a room, easier with 2 pairs of hands." I smiled, the truth of his words steadying me. "Then let's start." We worked in rhythm, though my strength was not his. Ethan cut the cedar logs, muscles taut as he swung the axe, while I gathered the split lengths and stacked them neat. My fingers stung from the cold, but I carried rail after rail, refusing to be idle. Each time he glanced at me, I caught not impatience, but quiet respect. By midday, we had laid the first frame. He held the post steady while I braced it with a crossbeam, my shoulder pressed firm against the wood. When it shifted, he caught it, his hand brushing mine. "Square enough," he said, and the rare curve of a smile touched his mouth. I laughed, breath misting in the air. I was a seamstress. Straight lines are my trade. His eyes lingered on me, as if the simple admission meant more than I knew. Then he drove the peg into place, the sound ringing across the snow like a promise. In the days that followed, the work became our language. We dug into frozen soil to set the posts, our breath rising in white plumes. We carried boards together, balanced across our shoulders. At the end of each day, my arms ached and my palms blistered. But when I looked at what we had raised, beam by beam, rail by rail, I felt a pride deeper than I had ever known. Inside the new frame, I began to carve small notches into one of the joists. At first, Ethan didn't notice. Each mark was a day we worked side by side, a quiet record of time kept not in sorrow, but in building. The wood held our story, silent and enduring. Evenings we returned to the cabin, our bodies weary, our silence companionable. I stitched while he read, or we sat together by the fire without need of words. Sometimes his hand brushed mine when passing a cup or steadying a bucket, and the touch lingered longer than before. One night, as the wind sighed soft instead of howling, I caught him mending a tear in his shirt. His stitches were uneven, rough, but careful. I smiled at the sight, remembering the coat he had repaired for me. "You'll put me out of work if you keep that up," I teased. He shook his head. "No, some things need your hands." I did not answer, but the words settled in me, deep and sure. We were no longer two souls passing through the same storm. We were laboring as one, binding the days with effort and small mercies. By the time the snow began to melt from the fence posts, the new room stood framed against the sky, a testament to what could be built when two lives chose not to walk alone. The new room stood bare, its timbers raw against the pale sky. We had not yet laid the roof, but already it felt like a promise, something waiting to be filled with warmth. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, we sat by the fire, our bodies worn from the day's work. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the Bible resting in his lap. His thumb traced the edges of the worn leather cover before he opened to a passage. His voice was low, steady, carrying over the crackle of the flames. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. He closed the book, letting the words linger. My heart tightened at their weight. I remembered my mother's voice reading that same verse back in Ohio, her hands folded over her apron, the scent of bread in the air. That was a lifetime ago, yet here, in this small cabin carved out of wilderness, the words felt alive again. I looked at Ethan, his face lit in the soft glow. He had known loss deeper than mine, carried silence heavier than most men could bear. Yet he had chosen to share his table, his fire, his days. Faith, hope, love. Yes, he carried them all. Without thinking, I reached across the small space between us and laid my hand over his. He did not move for a long moment. Then he turned his palm to meet mine, our fingers lacing together. No vows were spoken, no declarations. But in that quiet clasp, I felt the truth of the verse. Greater than faith, greater than hope, here was love, alive and steady. We did not need to say more. The fire warmed the room, and the wind outside carried no threat. Within the hush of that evening, our bond was sealed not by words, but by the unspoken certainty that neither of us would ever walk alone again. The snow pressed heavy against the cabin walls that night, muting every sound beyond the steady hiss of the fire. I sat at the table, my sewing set aside, watching the shadows shift along the logs. Ethan moved about quietly, closing the shutters, banking the fire. When he turned, his gaze met mine, and something passed between us that needed no words. I stood, my hands trembling, though not from the cold. "I don't want to sleep in the corner anymore," I said softly. The cot, once a mercy, now felt like distance I could no longer bear. He didn't speak. He simply waited, his stillness giving me room to finish. "I want to sleep beside the man who pulled me from the dark and never once asked me to earn it," I whispered. "And I want to wake up knowing I will not be sent away." He closed the space between us. His hands, rough from the day's labor, took mine with a gentleness that undid me. "You won't be," he said. The words were not a vow shouted into the wind, but a truth spoken as steady as the ground beneath our feet. We stood there, foreheads touching, breath mingling in the glow of the fire. No promises were exchanged, because none were needed. We had already spoken them in the tally marks carved into beams, in the bread kneaded side by side, in the silent evenings by the fire when presence was more than enough. That night I lay down beside him, my head resting against the steady rise and fall of his chest. The storm raged beyond the walls, but it could not touch us. For the first time since Ohio, I did not feel like a wanderer or a burden. I was home. When dawn came, the snow glistened untouched across the ridge. The sky washed clean. Inside the cabin, we rose together, no longer two souls surviving alone, but one life, one shelter, one love, chosen not by chance, but by faith and by quiet commitment. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. When spring finally broke across the Wyoming plains, it came slow but sure. The snow melted in ribbons along the ridge, carving little streams that glistened in the morning sun. Mud clung to our boots, and the air smelled of pine bark and damp soil. Life had shifted since that night of the storm. We no longer moved like two people bound by circumstance. We moved as one, each step taken with the knowledge that neither of us would turn away. I sat one morning by the well, the flat stone warmed by the sun, mending the strap of a saddlebag with steady hands. My cheeks carried color now, not from fever or fear, but from wind and sun. A stray lock of hair brushed across my forehead, caught by the breeze. Ethan came up from the creek trail leading a pack mule stacked high with cut firewood. He didn't announce himself. He never needed to. The quiet between us had become a language of its own. "New stitching?" he asked, crouching at the tool bench. "Yours," I said, holding the saddlebag. The buckle was pulling loose, would have split on the next ride. He studied my hands for a moment, his face unreadable but softened at the edges. "You always notice what's fraying," he murmured. "It's habit," I replied, tying the thread. "If you don't catch it early, things fall apart in your hands." That evening, we walked the property together, mud tugging at our boots. Near the eastern field, half buried beneath moss and needles, lay the remains of an old fence line, rotted timbers with rusted nails. I brushed dirt from a patch of blackened earth. "Looks like someone burned here long ago," I said. Ethan glanced out across the hills, his voice low. "Reminds me this place wasn't always mine." I touched his arm gently. "But it is now, and so am I." Rain came that night, sheets of it drumming the cabin roof. I stood by the window, lantern light casting my shadow across the floor. Ethan sat sharpening a blade, slow and steady, his gaze far away. I asked about the scar on his shoulder, the wound that had once nearly taken his life. He told me of cattle drives, gunfire in Kansas, and the moment he realized he could no longer follow another man's trail. I listened in silence, and when he finished, I sat at his feet, resting my head against his knee. "What would you have been," I asked, "if not a cattleman?" He considered, then said quietly, "Maybe a map maker. I like knowing what lies ahead." I smiled faintly. "I used to draw, too. Dresses I'd never sew, houses I'd never live in." "You're living in one now," he said, his hand brushing my hair. The next morning the storm had cleared, the sky sharp with sunlight. I gathered eggs from the hen house while Ethan split kindling, sleeves rolled high, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his arms. I leaned against the doorway, watching him work. "You ever think about building on?" I asked. He kept swinging, the axe biting into wood. "What did you have in mind?" "A second room, maybe a loft, a table that doesn't wobble when you lean on it." He set the axe aside, wiping his brow. "Sounds like you're planning on staying." I stepped closer, my voice steady. "I am." That night he brought me a folded sheet of paper, rough pencil lines scratched across it. A sketch of the cabin with a second room shaded in. "I'm no draftsman," he said, "but thought we could start here." "You left space for a porch," I said. "Thought you might want one." "You were right," I whispered, tracing the lines. We stood close in the lamplight, fire burning low. No vows were spoken, but every mark of that pencil was a promise. With each day, each nail, we were building more than a house. We were building something neither of us thought we'd find again, a life worth staying for. The hammering began before the frost had lifted from the grass. Each strike of the mallet rang sharp through the morning air as we set new timbers into place.
The cabin was no longer a shelter of one man's solitude. It was becoming a home for two. I held beams steady while Ethan drove the pegs. Sawdust clung to my skirt, and the air smelled of fresh-cut cedar. Every board lifted, every corner squared, felt like setting down another stone in the foundation of our life. As the weeks passed, the new room took shape, and so did the certainty that we belonged here, together. One evening, as the sun dipped gold behind the hills, I asked the question I had kept locked within me. "You ever think about marrying again?" He paused, the draw-knife still in his hand, shoulders taut. "I do now." I stepped down from the porch, boots in hand, the grass cool beneath my feet. "You haven't asked." "I didn't want to press you," he said. "Would you say yes if I did?" The air between us felt like held breath.
He had no ring, no preacher by his side, just the strength of a man who had chosen me long before this moment. "You've got me," I said softly. "That's enough." We married 3 days later beside the creek where the cottonwoods leaned over the water. Mrs. Elkins, the widow from 4 homesteads west, came as witness, her son carving a small pine cross to mark the place. A preacher rode up from Medicine Bow, his horse lathered from the long trail, and spoke the words over the sound of water rushing downstream. I wore the blue calico I had stitched myself. Ethan wore the patched shirt I had mended that first week. When he took my hand, neither of us let go for the rest of the day. The seasons turned, the porch filled with drying herbs, clay pots, and a wooden bench Ethan carved with his own hands. I planted beans, onions, and turnips in neat rows behind the shed. We rode into town together now, my own horse Alder carrying me steady on the trail. People stared at first, whispered as we passed, but the stares softened. By the time we left the mercantile, they greeted us with nods and small talk. The world beyond our cabin did not need to understand fully. It was enough that they saw us standing side by side. Years slipped by, marked not by loneliness, but by the rhythm of labor and rest, seed time and harvest. The cabin aged, weathered but strong, the porch rail smooth beneath our hands. We read aloud in the evenings, sometimes from newspapers carried from town, sometimes from the Bible. Ethan's voice lingered over certain verses, steady and sure. I found comfort in one especially. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Psalm 46:1. In those words, I heard the truth of our lives, rescued, sustained, and bound together. Children never came, but we did not feel the lack. We had the land, the seasons, and one another. I pressed herbs between cloth pages, labeling them with ink boiled from walnut husks. Ethan built me a drying table, his rough hands careful with each joint. Neighbors came by from time to time, trading news, sharing bread. And when the preacher's circuit brought him our way, we welcomed him at our table, the word echoing in our cabin as steady as the ticking clock on the shelf. Sometimes I still woke in the dark, listening for the wind that once chased me through the trees, but it was never the same wind anymore. This wind carried low across the ridge like a lullaby, brushing the eaves in gentle sighs. I would turn toward Ethan, warm beside me, and press my face into the crook of his neck. He always stirred just enough to pull me close. We had not built a life of riches, nor one free from hardship. But what we built was ours, every stitch, every beam, every quiet night by the fire. In saving me, Ethan had not only given me shelter, he had given me home. And in loving him, I had given him back something he thought buried forever, the chance to hope again. And so we endured, not as two lost souls adrift, but as one life, bound by faith, steadied by hope, and kept above all by love. Even now, when I think back on those days, I am struck not by the hardships, but by the grace hidden in small, ordinary mercies. A cup of warm water held steady in trembling hands, the sound of a hammer echoing across a cold morning, the quiet strength of a man who chose to stay, and a woman who dared to believe she was no longer lost. Perhaps that is what the frontier always was, not just survival against the wind and the wild, but the chance to find one another amidst the emptiness. And maybe that is why such stories endure. Because deep down, each of us longs for a place where faith, hope, and love still bind people together stronger than any fence post or rafter beam. If you've felt the pull of this tale, subscribe now to follow more true Wild West stories. Stories of hardship, redemption, and the kind of love that still speaks across the years.